Hey, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. And in today's video, I want to talk about a approach to modern philosophy from the perspective of Thomas Aquinas. Now, of course, Thomas Aquinas lived about over 1,000 years ago, so we're not going to be actually less than 1,000 years ago. So we're not going to be um, applying Thomas to the present in a ahistorical way. Actually, we are going to be doing that. Sorry, we're going to be applying Saint Thomas Aquinas's philosophy not in its own historical context, but in a certain sense, speculatively to our own historical context. So, how do we do that? So, I made some notes here to talk about this, and I want to begin by bringing up a quote from C.S. Lewis. This is a quote that he wrote in a book called God in the Dock. This is a compilation of essays from C.S. Lewis. And one of the essays is titled, Is Theism Important? And in it, he has a quote that's been paraphrased often in a way that's faithful to the essence of the quote. And here's how it goes. So Lewis writes, quote, For a pagan, as history shows, is sorry, let me reread that. For a pagan, as history shows, is a man eminently convertible to Christianity. He is essentially the pre-Christian or sub-Christian religious man. The post-Christian man of our day differs from him as much as a divorcee differs from a virgin. End quote. So that's a quote from C.S. Lewis. And I want to talk about this because we're talking about St. Thomas Aquinas, his philosophy and theology, and how it can be a fruitful response to various forms of modern philosophy. Now, this video is one of the many recent videos I've been making on the philosophy and theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. But not just that, but I've been talking about his historical context, who he was, the movements of his time, how to properly read him in context and to understand exactly what he's been saying, what he's writing about, etc. Now, a huge theme in that conversation is his relationship to Aristotle. In the High Middle Ages, of course, Aristotle was introduced in a way that it has no precedent because we've had texts of Aristotle through Boethius and others who incorporated them in their study of Plato, and of course the encounter of the Greek heritage with Christian revelation. But in the High Middle Ages, through the translations of Arabs, we have the almost the entire corpus of Aristotle being introduced into the Middle Ages in a time of crisis, in a time of religious and political crisis. And what this does is it introduces this really intricate and intellectual view of the world that is its own consistent approach, right? In a world that is in the midst of an upheaval in terms of understanding itself, and it's kind of splintering and collapsing. So what do we do now? And St. Thomas Aquinas goes about the task of synthesizing this world of Aristotle and this world of the religious tradition of Christianity, which is epitomized in Augustine. So in other words, Thomas takes something alien at first, right, and synthesizes it and kind of, converts it, you might say, and it facilitates its merging with the status quo of the tradition of the Western Christian world. Now, of course, later on after that, this starts to disintegrate, especially in Rene Descartes, who kind of reverts to the split between Aristotle's worldliness and Christian revelation set apart. That's a conversation for another time. So, what I wanted to say is that going back to this quote from C.S. Lewis, right, that you have this kind of pre Christian paganism that is kind of like a virgin that is just waiting to get married, right, to be betrothed to the bridegroom, Christ. And assumed into the church in that way, right? And then you have post-Christianity, which is a kind of rejection of the marriage, right? This disintegration that you start to see in modern philosophy. And here Lewis compares this to a divorcee. And he's saying, thus we have, two very different situations. Now, I want to add some nuance to Lewis's quotes. And this is some nuance that Lewis himself was very much aware of. So you have to understand what he's saying in what context. But when Thomas baptizes Aristotle. Yes, he baptizes a pre-Christian pagan and makes him a Christian, right? And therefore he has to kind of, break him apart and put him back together as part of the synthesis. So he has to change Aristotle. But he does baptize him. Yes, so Lewis's quote works here, right? Aristotle wasn't anti-Christian. However, right, Aristotle, it's better to say it's not that he was a virgin who needed to be married to Christ. It's more that him and all of paganism was kind of represented for lack of a better term, a prostitute, right? Because there was a lot of errors in the ancient world that needed to be purified, right? And so you could say that in ancient religion and in ancient philosophy, you have these errors that needed to be purified through the light of revelation so that the marriage and the synthesis might happen. So let me just read what I have here in my notes on my computer. So Thomas baptized Aristotle. Yes, but Aristotle was a virgin who could be married to Christ, tells us Lewis, right? Well, Lewis doesn't mention Aristotle, but you get the point. Now, Hegel and Nietzsche and others are not virgins that can be espoused to Christianity, but divorcees whose thought presupposes the rejection of the bridegroom. And so the argument goes, therefore, we cannot baptize them. And this is true, right? In a certain sense. Let me add some qualifications. So, reading the second paragraph I have here, I write, in a sense, yes, but two things need to be considered. Number one, Aristotle and antiquity was not simply a virgin. This woman had demons alongside her good natural qualities. That's the first point. The second point is that the moderns, not unlike adulterous Israel of old, are also comparable to prodigal sons and lost sheep that reveals something of the nature of God's presence through the experience of his absence. Let me go ahead and reread that because this is important, right? So, number one, right? Number one, Aristotle is not just this perfect, virgin waiting to be betrothed, right? There's some serious problems in Aristotle that Aquinas purifies him of, right? So that's the first point. Aristotle and antiquity in general, right, is not simply a virgin. And Lewis agrees with this, and I'll give some examples in just a second, right? This woman had demons, right, alongside her good natural qualities in the realm of religion and in the realm of philosophy. Now, the second point is the crucial one that I want to focus on. The moderns, yes, it's much different. They've rejected Christianity, but the way in which they do it is actually important for us because we live in the world of that rejection, right? So the moderns, and not unlike Israel itself, who was called out as an adulteress for basically not being faithful to her spousal union with Yahweh, but actually mingling with other nations and their gods, right? Not unlike adulterous Israel of old, these moderns are comparable to the prodigal sons and to the lost sheep that we hear about in the parables. And that journey of leaving the father's house and then coming back teaches us something very crucial that actually furthers the history and life of the church. I mean, just think of the liturgy of Easter Vigil when we speak of the original sin as, of course, a break in the initial marriage of creation and creator. But this break, this sin, is called a felix culpa, a happy fault, because it's through that sin, paradoxically, that we receive such a great Redeemer that then enlightens everything from within the darkness in a way that gives us a contrast that puts into relief the mystery of God in a much more dramatic way, honestly. So, okay, let's go ahead and look at this idea of paganism as a prostitute. So, paganism is more of a prostitute than a virgin. Now, Lewis is aware of this, right? And I'll give you an example. If you read the Chronicles of Narnia, right, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, as well as in The Silver Chair, you have this theme of the enemy being a woman, right? And this woman is usually a sorceress or a witch, right? So in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's the White Witch. In The Silver Chair, it's I don't remember her name, but she's a sorceress that turns into a snake, right? And so, of course, Lewis here is playing with the themes of the Whore of Babylon. He's playing, that you read in the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse. of course, the adulterous Israel, all these kinds of images, right? But ultimately, Babylon, right? So Israel is adulterous when she starts to look and act like Babylon, right? Which is pagan and idolatrous and riddled with demons and division, right? And so Lewis is aware of this dark side of paganism pre Christ, right? He's also aware of the good because there's what Lewis calls the good dreams of humanity. So it's a mixed bag, in other words. So one way to put it is that, ancient paganism, she's a woman capable of betrothal and of monogamy through conversion, right? But a poison is present within her as well that needs to be done away with through Christ, right? So now I want to flip the analogy and start talking about the moderns, right? So people like Descartes, Locke, Hume, Berkeley, um, Hegel, Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Marx and Sartre. I'm going to talk about all these guys, right? So here's the thing. We're going to switch the analogy now, where the woman is the church, right? And these philosophers, in a certain sense, have decided to walk away from the church, right? They've decided to divorce themselves from the church. And this is the drama. Not only is this different from ancient paganism in the sense of before and after marriage, but it's also the analogy itself is also flipped, where the church here is the woman and it's the philosophers that are stepping away from her. So let's look at the aftermath of this divorce for each of these philosophers. And I want to use an analogy to kind of summarize in a kind of a sweeping way that's not going to do justice to the complexity and depth of this conversation. But okay, let's start with Descartes, right? So arguably, and someone who makes a good case for this is Maurice Blondel. So let me actually talk about this. So at first, Blondel was so Maurice Blondel is a French philosopher from the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was a devout Catholic who studied at the time in France. There was a very severe separation between church and state, between Catholic schools and secular schools, right? He studied at the secular school in Paris, and he studied modern philosophy, and he wrote his dissertation in modern philosophy, in conversation with people like Spinoza, Leibniz, and things like this, right? And so Blondel was a faithful Catholic trying to understand modern philosophy from within in order to kind of discover, first of all, its internal consistency, but also its internal inconsistencies, right? Its lack of sufficiency, because the huge thing that modern philosophy at the time in France prided itself on was its self sufficiency and its autonomy from the religious, right? And so Blondel was very much interested in showing how that is just simply not the case and showing it purely on philosophical grounds, right? And so what he did is he basically entered into that world and kind of tried to burst it from within and open it back up towards a conversion of life, a return, a prodigal return, you might say, towards its realization that it needs religion, that it needs the supernatural and therefore revelation and things like that, and the church ultimately, right? So this is Blondel's project. I mean, we don't have time to talk about Blondel too much, but I'm bringing him up because he got some flack, of course, from these secular philosophers who thought he was, in a kind of backhanded way, introducing religion into philosophy, which threatened the autonomy that philosophy wanted to have for itself. Of course, he went at pains to show that that wasn't the case. Just checking the live stream. Hey, what's up, Derek? What's up, Chris? I'll go ahead and read you guys' comments in just a second. Let me get back to my notes. Yeah, so Blondel was basically, people were afraid that Blondel was introducing religion into philosophy, right? And in his dissertation and in his defense of his dissertation, he shows, based on philosophy, not on theology or revelation, that he is being strictly philosophical and he's not crossing the boundary and he's respecting the what he would call the relative autonomy of philosophy. That's the first thing. And so at first, people on the side of religion, right, were saw in Blondel a ally, but then suddenly people on the side of religion started to get a little uncomfortable with Blondel as well, because they thought that he was not being faithful enough to the theological side. And here he got into some controversies, some debates with some Thomists, right? And he was very dissatisfied with the state of Thomism at the time, and he hadn't read any Thomas Aquinas at the time where he first got into these debates, and he wrote his book Letter on Apologetics. And so what happened was he attributed at first to the Middle Ages a poor union being established between faith and reason, philosophy and theology, a kind of, it was a kind of having them side by side, acting like they are compatible, but without a deeper unity actually existing. And he says that this is why they so quickly separated and created secularism on one side and a kind of ghettoized reaction of Christianity against the secular Enlightenment on the other side, right? And so Blondel thought that this was because Aquinas was lacking, right? But as he was getting into these debates, he realized very quickly that he needed to read Aquinas, right? Actually go back and read him. So he started to read Aquinas' Summa contra Gentiles, right? The Summa against the pagans. And what he discovered blew him away. And he started to realize that Aquinas himself was not at all like the Thomists that he was arguing with. And he started to realize that Aquinas had a very robust understanding of the unity of faith and reason, of philosophy and theology, that was actually exactly what he was looking for and what he had already been arguing for. And so he changes his mind, right, on paper. You can see this, and says, "I was wrong. Aquinas gets this right." He overall uses Aquinas throughout his writings from then on. Although I think he quibbles here and there with various aspects of Aquinas where he prefers Augustine or things like that. But the point being is that he very much realizes that Aquinas got it right. And so that leads him to conclude that it's in Descartes that this split happens. And then he goes through this massive explanation of why, and it's beautiful and it's great, and you should read it. You can find a summary of it in Oliva Blanchet's book on Blondel called Maurice Blondel, A Philosophical Life. Okay, that whole tangent was for me to say that the divorce between faith and reason, philosophy and theology, enlightenment, reason, and religion, right, does not happen in Aquinas. Aquinas is the antidote, and Blondel realized this. It happens in Descartes. And I'm saying this because this brings us to the first character in this divorce, Descartes. So Descartes divorces the church, his wife, right? Revelation. But he doesn't move out of the house, right? So this is the first analogy. Descartes is at least ostensibly faithful Catholic. He goes to mass, receives the sacraments, believes in God, believes in Christ. He believes in Christianity, he lives his Christianity, but in his mind, he divorces natural reason and its application to this world and faith and religion, right? But he lives in this kind of bifurcated way. His writings kind of evince this divorce, but he doesn't move out of the house, right? And so John Locke shows up, and the analogy I use for John Locke is that Locke finally decides to bring his wife to court, right? And this is where things are legally formalized, you might say. And John Locke basically divides ideality from materiality. He's kind of furthering the logic of Descartes, right? And so you have the rise from John Locke of idealism on one side and materialism or empiricism, you might say, on the other, right? And so idealism and materialism are kind of made to be incompatible. And this is where David Hume shows up. And David Hume basically moves out of the house and gets his own place, right? He leaves idealism behind and basically is focused on empiricism and the senses and rejects all the whole realm of ideas, right, of causality and things like that. So, and on the other side of Hume, you have Berkeley, who is a Scottish bishop, if I remember correctly. But Berkeley, basically, he thinks that he's still married to the wife, right, in his mind, but she's left with the kids, right? And so all he has is this idealism. He sees the whole world as this kind of idealistic system. But it's not a realist philosophy, right? And matter is just thought in the mind of God. And so it doesn't give nature and creation an independence of its own, and therefore philosophy an independence of its own. And so philosophy, in a certain sense, kind of gets absorbed into a kind of theocratic vision for Berkeley, right? Intellectual theocratic vision. But this leads us to the inverse of Berkeley, and in a certain sense, the kind of culminating point of all of modern philosophy, which is Hegel. So Hegel basically he goes ahead, after the divorce, right? So they went to court. There's a divorce. Hegel's moved out, right? Kind of like Hume, uh, and Berkeley doesn't want to deal with the reality, so he's in the ideality. He thinks he's still married. Hegel is this divorced, dude who's like, you know what? I'm gonna go back over there and steal my wife. I'm gonna kidnap her and bring her home with me, right? So Hegel goes ahead and kidnaps his wife back, right? Now, here's what's interesting about this, right? Another analogy you could use for Hegel is that he robs the bank, right? The bank of Christianity has its riches. Hegel shows up, right? And he's not supposed to be doing this. This is not the normal order of things, but he steals all the riches in the bank and he brings them to his house, right? One way I like to describe this is it's the immanentization of the transcendent, right? He collapses theology and divine revelation into reason and philosophy and creates his dialectic of spirit, right? And so for him, all of the riches of Christianity are the patrimony of reason alone, right? Now, I don't have time to talk about Kant. He doesn't really fit my narrative here, but of course he's important. But let's just stick to Hegel. Hegel is the pinnacle, right? Hegel basically steals the wife back, right? And collapse and because he's not supposed to, right? Because a marriage is a free union between two loving people, right? A synthesis that has distinction and unity, right? Here, Hegel collapses the other into the self, right? Into reason in this immanent dialectic of spirit. Marx will invert this dialectic. But before we talk about Marx, let's talk about Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Sartre. Heidegger, this analogy, I shared it with a friend, and they laughed. They thought it was funny. So bear with me, right? So Heidegger basically is sick and tired of this wife that's living in the attic after she divorced him, right? But they're still married, right? Because divorce doesn't undo a sacramental marriage. So Heidegger basically just kills his wife, right? He kills her, but suddenly, a few days later, he realizes that the marriage wasn't actually valid, right? That he realizes that the person he was living with wasn't actually his wife. There was not all the needed matter or canonical form for the marriage. And so the analogy here is basically Heidegger criticizes the tradition by calling it ontotheology. It's this kind of rationalistic grasping at being, right? But Heidegger doesn't like this fact that we're grasping at being and putting it into our concepts and reducing it to this, right? He calls this ontotheology. He wants a much more existential approach to the unfathomable mystery of being, right? And so Heidegger basically just shoots the wife, right, and says, "Let's start over," right? But what you realize is that this ontotheology that Heidegger is criticizing, he's correct to criticize, but it's not actually the tradition. It's not Aquinas, right? It's later. And so, in other words, Heidegger, by shooting down his wife, realizes that he didn't actually shoot down his wife. He shot down this other woman that wasn't supposed to be his wife. And that's the point about Heidegger. And so, a lot there that could be learned from that, right? And of course, then Nietzsche comes along, and Nietzsche, how to put this without making a joke out of it? Nietzsche is gay. Like like Nietzsche basically wants to be the author of values, right? He wants to redefine everything, right? Including marriage, including autonomy, including right and wrong. He wants to redefine everything. And he wants to redefine not only values, but fate itself by being assimilated to fate, by being assimilated to being in himself as the Übermensch, right? So the famous amor fati, love of fate, where he becomes in this eternal recurrence one with fate, and that liberates him through this kind of self apotheosis. And this is why Henry de Lubac called him the first European Buddhist, right? And so Nietzsche is just like, screw all this, bye, right? And I'm with myself, right? And so there's this narcissism that's glorified there in Nietzsche. Now we'll get into why all of these modern philosophers are important to know about and how to tackle them. Let's look at Sartre real quick, Jean-Paul Sartre, right? So Sartre basically is just looking around in this chaotic world, and so he just decides, you know what, screw this. And he regresses to a kind of emo teenager phase, right? Where he casts off all authority and God in particular so that he can authentically express his autonomy, right? And so existence precedes essence, so I can make myself who I am and not be pressured by the dictates of society, so that I can be authentic, right? And express myself apart from all of these constrictions. And so I create myself because there's no creator creating me, and therefore nature to which I must be subservient. And so this radical liberation, which ends up being hell, literally, as Sartre himself describes it, right? Now, the last person I want to talk about is Marx. So Marx, this is another joke. I hope this is not too crude, but Marx thinks he can have kids through onanism, right? He's on his own. He doesn't need the other, right? And he thinks he can have kids, right? That's just not how it works, right? You need the other. You need the transcendent. But Marx thinks that within the immanent, he can bring about this utopia, this heaven on earth, right? But it's an open-ended search for utopia that doesn't resolve itself within Marx's own material dialectic. So he's aware of that. So it's weird. It's this frustrating, open-ended onanism. This is a weird analogy, right? But bear with me. That's kind of what Marx is doing. So let me just recapitulate a little bit here, right? So we quoted Lewis talking about, and I'm getting to Aquinas. I promise. This is all connected. But we quoted Lewis saying that paganism is like a virgin, and post-Christian paganism is like a divorcee, and obviously agreed with Lewis. But there's more to it. More to it that Lewis himself would agree in various other areas of his writings, which is that paganism is not just a virgin, it's a prostitute who needs to convert and be monogamous and faithful, right? So there's good and bad in the pagan woman. Now, with the post Christians, they're not just divorcees, right? But you could almost say that they're, adulterers or prodigal sons or lost sheep who are rebelling against the father, rebelling against the shepherd, rebelling against the bridegroom. And by flipping the analogy, you could say rebelling against the woman, the church. But in all of these rebellions, we learn something crucial. Let me go through the rebellions real quick, and then let's talk about what we learn from them. So Descartes basically divorces his wife, but still lives with her. Locke brings her to court and makes the legal sanction official. Hume moves out, right? Berkeley thinks he's still married, but the wife and the kids already moved out, and he's in his mind, right? Hegel goes back and steals his wife to live with him through force, which collapses this otherness and unity, this fruitful union, right? Heidegger shoots her, but realizes that she wasn't actually his wife, that he shot the wrong person. So he's wrong about the tradition. Nietzsche just wants to run off with another man and do his own thing, right? Sartre just regresses, when it comes to maturity, and becomes emo teenager and rebels against all authority and establishes himself and makes his own nature and the world around him, right? And it becomes hell for him, right? I mean, if that's not the prodigal son, I don't know what is, right? Marx, meantime, rejected the spouse, but thinks he can have kids on his own. And it's frustrating because it doesn't work and it gets worse. And that's Marx, right? Okay, so what does all this teach us? Well, one thing it teaches us is this: Descartes, Locke, Hume, and Berkeley help us to avoid reducing our philosophy to an easy idealism or to a practical materialism. And it does this by forcing us to reevaluate the deep and mysterious unity that ties matter and spirit, thought and will, necessity and freedom together. A deeper ontology that you can discover prior to Descartes, right? Prior to the disintegration. And I would argue in Aquinas, right? And this unity and distinction is something that brings together matter and form, right? Ideality and materiality in a synthesis that can only be explained in a profound way through the category of creation, of esse that is shared, and of essence that it receives esse, and that both come from God, who freely creates and gives to creation an independence of its own, a relative independence of its own, which establishes it in a freedom of its own, a reality of its own, not just an ideality, that can respond to God in love and create a marriage between God and man in Christ, the synthesis of both. And so a Christological ontology here is so much deeper than these bifurcations in modern philosophy that reduce thought to an easy idealism or practical materialism, right? And so that's why recovering the tradition is recovering a much deeper metaphysics that can actually unify these bifurcations. And we come to appreciate more deeply the full breadth and depth of this ontological synthesis through the rebellions and their consequences. We come to see how much more profound the metaphysical tradition actually is. And unlike Heidegger, we don't shoot this onto theology, but we recover the one that we've been married to all along. And that's the idea of thinking within a tradition, right? It's not divorcing the wife, but coming back and realizing where things got wrong and working from that new foundation, which ultimately doesn't lie in one or the other spouse, but in Christ, right? Who is the foundation of the church and of the world that's being transformed by the church. Okay, so that's Descartes, Locke, Hume, and Berkeley. They really teach us how to navigate between idealism and materialism in a way that goes behind these two divides in a much more profound ontology of the tradition, which comes through this Thomistic synthesis through the category of creation, which is Christologically founded. Go watch my previous video on Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle for more of that. Okay, Hegel and Heidegger. So Hegel and Heidegger help us understand the relationship between immanence and transcendence, history and ontology, being and becoming. And they do so in such a crucial way. Just think of Hegel. Hegel steals the riches of the bank and brings them home. What this teaches us is precisely what it means for the bank to have its own riches and for us not being able to appropriate them, while for us needing to have a proper relationship with the bank as an autonomous other, without which we wouldn't be able to survive in society. The analogy is horrible, but bear with me, right? Think of the bank as the church. I hate to compare the church to a bank. It's very worldly, but bear with me. The bank is the church, and the riches is the tradition, right? And the tradition, of divine revelation. If you steal that, unlawfully and collapse it within Hegel's immanent synthesis, right? Then what you have is the loss of transcendence. And this leads directly to Marx, who inverts the whole thing and cuts us off from God, and then creates political theology in a negative sense, where we try to usher in heaven on earth. So that's why we can learn immensely from Hegel on the nature of transcendence and the relationship between the transcendent and the immanent, but also the relationship between history, its dialectics, right, and being and its dialectics, and then the relationship between both sets of dialectics, right? And it's we have to kind of invert Hegel's dialectics and open up its immanent frame to the transcendent, which kind of goes beyond the dialectics of our own reason and shows their insufficiency. This is what Blondel was all about, by the way. And finally, being and becoming. This is something else that Blondel is really good on. Realizing the radical insufficiency of the world of becoming, and yet of its mediation of the world of being, and therefore the trajectory of becoming and its aspiration towards union with being in itself, right? I mean, this is something that we can learn from Hegel, right? Precisely because he's wrong about these things, he forces us to reconsider and sometimes to consider for the first time certain aspects of this relationship, right? And Heidegger, same reasons as Hegel. The only difference between Heidegger and Hegel is that Heidegger shoots the woman, Hegel kidnaps her, right? But both of those relationships, you see, show us something about the right order between the spouse and the bridegroom, the bride and the bridegroom, right? And how that's necessary for the flourishing of human history and human beings, human nature. Okay, this leads us to Nietzsche, right? So Nietzsche, he helps us realize how Western values, right, which he wants to shirk off and create his own, right? Nietzsche helps us realize how Western values are impossible without the Nazarene, without Christ, right? He's so good at this, right? Precisely in his rebellion, in the consistency of his rebellion. He's similar to Heidegger in a certain sense here, but much more radical, right? In the consistency of his rebellion, he calls out the liberal lie, right? The lie that we can have all the values of Christianity without Christ. Nietzsche is your best apologist against liberalism, ironically, right? And he's kind of like the proto post liberal, but in a very negative register. I mean, he basically rejects the whole project, right? But by doing that, he shows you the inconsistencies and the problems with the liberal project, and with the project. Think of it this way: he calls out the man who's divorced from the wife, who still wants the wife to help him out at the house or something, right? He's like, "Look, you divorce her or you don't." Nietzsche's consistent. He divorces her and he redefines marriage and he goes off and does his own thing, right? This is why I meant Nietzsche is gay, right? So that's what Nietzsche does, right? And so he forces you to come to terms that you have to choose between the Nazarene and Dionysius, right? This is a famous saying from Nietzsche. You have to choose. And that is a powerful apologetic from someone who's rejected God, right? And so that shows you, again, the relevance of Nietzsche for our time. Okay, Marx. So Marx is important, really important. Marx forces us to reevaluate the relationship between various critical couplets. This is so important. Ratzinger is huge on this, right? And I'm getting back to Thomas in just a second. But Marx forces us to reevaluate the relationship between faith and politics, between hope, true theological hope, and ethical justice, right, in society, right? These are distinct things. They're collapsed in Marx, right? Again, also in Marx, because he's a child of Hegel, transcendence and immanence, right? Marx immanentizes everything in his material dialectic. And finally, and this is crucially important, and there's one author that I want to spend time reading that I haven't read him directly yet, but I've been reading a lot of Father de Lubac has been talking about this other priest. His name is Father Gaston Fessard, right? Gaston Fessard studied a lot of Hegel and basically inverted Hegel's master-slave dialectic into a father-son dialectic that opens back up towards the transcendent and actually shows a beautiful alternative to Hegel for society, right? So Gaston Fessard is a great example of learning from these divorced men, right? Something about healthy marriage in a negative register, right? Precisely, one way to think of it is that they're negative prophets, right? Freud could be categorized here as well, but they're negative prophets, um, and they kind of return us back to before the disintegration of the tradition. So anyway, Marx forces us to reevaluate the relationship between church and state, faith and politics, right? Theological hope and the virtue of justice in the city, right? Transcendence and immanence, and of course, power and authority. This is why I brought up Gaston Fessard, right? Power and authority. Right? Marx kind of collapses authority into raw power. Recovering the distinction between power and authority is one of the ways through which to burst out of the immanent dialectics of Marx back into a transcendent opening through dialectical reason, right? And its insufficiency to a revelation, to a symbolic order of something being received through mediation. That is what Marx, in a negative way, can push us in the direction of, right? Okay, back to Thomas Aquinas. I bring all this up because Thomas Aquinas dealt with the so-called virgin of paganism, which was in fact a prostitute, which he converted, baptized, and wedded to Christ, right? Well, Thomas has also the resources to deal with people like Heidegger and Hegel because he's not representing the tradition of the wife that Hegel shot, right? But something before that. He's not representing the tradition of the wife that Heidegger had shot, of the wife that Hegel had collapsed and stolen and brought back to his house, right? He represents this fruitful, peaceful, unity between spouses, you might say. So Thomas actually latent within his texts is a rich response to all of these things, but a response that actually is open to being taken up in a speculative register, kind of an ahistorical way, and updated and furthered and developed in light of all of these modern philosophers, right? And that's why it's important to engage with modern philosophy while acknowledging that it is not the same thing as a pre Christian philosophy. Totally granted, and that the poisons are different. But one thing we have to not be naive about is that the poison is present before Christ as well as after Christ. Sure, it's a different kind of poison, and you could even argue that the post Christian poison is more insidious, right? It's more subtle, and you have to be extra careful. All of that is granted. But that doesn't mean that we must shy away from engaging with these philosophers and that we can't learn from this engagement. And we're called to do that because, whether you like it or not, these philosophers have shaped the world that we live in right now. And the way to get out of that world is to do kind of what Blondel did. It's just to go into it and burst it from within and actually show it to itself its own insufficiencies, right? Blondel called this a method of I think he called it a method of insufficiency, right? Another word that's similar is method of immanence. But he shows within philosophy its own radical insufficiency and its need for something other, namely revelation, religion, right? But just that move actually transforms from within modern philosophy and makes it move away towards all of its errors, right? But from within. And that's on the side of the philosopher, right? The theologian has to engage this from a different standpoint. Okay, so Thomas, right? So Thomas, remember, what does he do with Aristotle? He doesn't just sanction Aristotle, he baptizes him, which means he calls him to conversion and has him die and break apart, right? Divide in a certain sense, and then be reborn, reconstituted, reunited as a new creation, a new man. And the way he does this, the way Thomas Aquinas does this with Aristotle, is that he existentializes Aristotle, right? And how? Through the doctrine of creation, which purges Aristotle of the poison of secularism, of worldliness, right? This opens up a vision of distinction in unity between philosophy and theology, faith and reason, right? It opens up, through this distinction in unity, a possibility for participation, a whole understanding of the world that is one of participation, which brings us back to a vision of now unity in distinction, right? So distinction and unity, which makes participation possible, which brings us back to unity and distinction. This is the exitus reditus schema of the Summa Theologiae, right? And so what this means is that in Thomas Aquinas is addressed, right, a profound. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Thomas's theology and philosophy addresses all of these. Sorry, I'm trying to read from my notes here. This addresses offers profound research. Yeah, I miswrote that. So Thomas's philosophy and theology offers profound resources for all of the disjunctions mentioned above, right? Hegel, Heidegger, Sartre, Nietzsche, Marx, right? Thomas offers a profound resources for all of these dysfunctions mentioned above, which in turn, these dysfunctions, right, through them being dysfunctions, can actually deepen and even further our contemplation of the relationship between God and the world, which is, at the heart of all of this, right? And this relationship has direct consequences on culture, politics, history, human thought, all of that stuff. And so the importance of Aquinas, precisely because at what point in time he lived, what he was channeling, what tradition, and how brilliantly he did it, and how ever fruitful his texts are. This is why Thomas Aquinas holds such a pride of place in the tradition of the church, and why he's so important, and why we have to turn to him to gather some resources, sometimes even develop them from his texts in order to approach the world of modernity, right? And so that, I think, is a relationship between Thomas and modern philosophy, right? It's precisely his place in time and his genius that gives us resources to discern the disjunctions of modern philosophy. And in order to learn from this dialogue between the tradition and the deviations and splinterings away from the tradition that we see in all of these philosophers. And that's the job of a good philosopher today, right? And to an extent, a theologian has to engage with philosophy as well. So, yeah, so that's basically what I was trying to get at in this video. It was a bit discombobulated. I hope that the analogies helped. Let me go ahead and check the chat. Let me scroll all the way back up. So Chris says, "Isn't Thomas doing that great for enculturation during that time, though?" Not sure what you mean. I think what you mean is he not enculturating Aristotle in medieval Christendom? If that's what you're saying, yes, he's doing it. That you could say that's what he's doing. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Maybe ask it in a separate message. Let's see what you have here. I like Lewis's space trilogy, so I'm about to read that next. I haven't read it. Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. Good to know. I will be definitely looking out for that. I'm looking forward to reading that trilogy. Description philosophically sounds like Rene is putting Descartes before the horse. Yeah, exactly. David Hume gives Protestant huge problems. He does. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'll take your word on that. Poor Hegel. Sartre, emo teenager. Yeah, go ahead and steal that. Definitely do. Appreciate it, Chris. I'm glad you're enjoying this. Okay, well, thanks, guys. If you have any questions, now's the time before I log off. If you enjoy this kind of content, give this video a like. It helps spreading them, and share the video if you want to, if you find it interesting. But definitely, if anything else, subscribe and hit that notification bell for the next video I'm going to do, which is going to be on the Latin of St. Thomas, the way in which he writes, and the way in which he teaches. And hit that notification bell. So, of course, consider supporting me, $1, $2, $5 at patreon.com/logos project. And you can go to my website, theecclesiablog.com, if you want to sign up to some of the courses I give. Okay, well, thanks for tuning in, guys, and we'll see you all for the next video. God bless.